Hello and welcome to another episode of Exploring Standards. I am your host, Jess, and today I'm welcoming back on the show, Rob. Rob is the CEO and Director of Assent Risk Management. Rob, how are you today?
Hi, Jess. Yeah, very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you for asking. So today, our episode, we are looking at our top non-conformances for ISO 27001-2022. So obviously the transition period for this over to this new standard, or the new version of this standard, I should say, is actually October this year. So we are going to be looking at the top non-conformances that we've noticed for the clients that we have worked with. Before we get into that, can you just give us a real quick overview of the standard, please?
Yeah, of course. So ISO 27001 is the standard for information security. It's been around a number of years now. I think this is the third edition as an ISO. And before that, there's a British standard that was very similar. And information security covers not just IT security, but it covers elements of human resources, so people security, physical security of the building or the premises, and also it covers any paper records or any type of information really that you have. So there's a mixture of organisational controls, people controls, physical controls, and technological controls. That's the four parts of the new standard. So it's well established, and many people are already certified to the previous version of the standard, which is 2013. And as you rightly say, in October 2025, there's a deadline that everyone on the old standard has to be on the new 2022 version. Now, before that, there was a deadline that meant that if you were recertifying, so as you get to the end of your 3-year cycle, they weren't actually issuing new certificates to the 2013 version. So people had to make the jump at that point to 2022. But this year, 25 in October, is the absolute deadline. So after that, we need everyone to be on the new version of the standard if they're keeping their certificate, which most people are, because it's still a very popular standard and a very popular subject in the supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. So say you listen to this podcast now and it's past October 2025 and you're thinking, oh, we haven't changed over. What do we do? What do they need to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's natural that people leave it to the last minute, and we all put off the things that we dread, right? So although we have a number of jobs that we did early on in the cycle, the nearer it gets to October, the more transition work is coming in, and the more we're helping companies to meet that. So if you're listening to this and it's past that deadline, obviously that's not great, and it means your certificate has probably expired. So most likely the certification body will want you to recertify, and will probably treat it as a new certification, so a stage 1 and a stage 2. In some cases, there might be time within the period of it lapsing, so you can recover a certificate. But again, being a transition audit, it's unlikely that you'll be able to retain that. So it's not a complete disaster because you've already got a system in place, right? It just isn't certified. So the first thing to do would be to talk to consultants like Assent, make sure that your system is ready for the new version of the standard. So there's a number of new controls in there. Everything's been reorganised and renumbered, so that needs to be addressed. And there's a couple of other changes in the framework which are fairly minor, but they need to be addressed. So if you come to us at Assent, we'll help you get prepared for that. And then also our people here in the office liaise with the certification bodies quite regularly. So we can help you get back on track with the certification body, or go to the market and get 3 quotes for some new prices for certification. So again, we could take that tricky situation and make a positive out of it, and go to the market, start a new relationship with a certification body for your standards.
That's fab. Thank you for that. It's good to know that it's not going to be a complete disaster if by some reason you haven't got there, transitioned over by the end of the deadline. So before we really get into the top 5 non-conformances that we've found, can you just explain to our listeners kind of where we've got this data from? So how have we come up with these top 5 non-conformances?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a proactive ISO consultancy, Assent records anonymously all the findings that we come across. So these are from internal audits that our people do, and also the external audits that the certification bodies do. Now, thankfully, where we're involved, there isn't too many non-conformities from the certification bodies, but obviously sometimes they come up and sometimes there's issues. But from both sides, from the internal audits and the external audits, we put those findings into a database. As I say, it's anonymised, so there's no way to trace it back to our clients in any way. But what that data gives us is a real good trend analysis of what's going on out there. So with established standards that have been around a while, what we tend to see is trends in what certification auditors start to look for. So you start to see where they might have been told to focus on a particular area, and you suddenly get some findings in that area. But in this case, and what's really helpful for us here is because we're towards the end of the transition cycle, we've done a number of transition jobs already, helping people move to the new version of the standard. And so the data we've recorded from that is highlighting where the weaknesses and where the tricky areas are for companies, mostly from our internal audit findings. And that's helping us inform our future transition work, because we know they're the areas that we can put a little bit of extra attention to. And of course, if you're listening to this podcast and you're working on a 27001 system yourself, hopefully this information is going to be quite useful to you. I think we picked out 5 of the top findings against the new standard for ISO 27001, and they're the areas that you should keep an eye on.
That's fabulous. And this database that we have is available for everyone to see?
Yeah, so we have 2 versions of it. So we have our own, we have an internal version that's, again, is anonymised. So you can't trace it back to the clients. There's some other metrics in there. But we do also put that together with some of our colleagues and peers with their anonymous data. So there is some other organisations that do this. And through an association called UK Consulting, we have a public dashboard that has a limited subset of that information. Again, completely anonymised. There'd be no way to trace it back to anyone, but it does just show the clauses and the standards where these things are raised.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that. So let's get into our the top 5 non-conformances. And our first one on our list is suppliers. So can you talk about that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, by some way, the suppliers is the biggest non-conformity we've seen against the new standards. So this is the ISO 27001 2022. I think there's a couple of reasons for this. I think supplier management is always quite a tricky area, and it does appear in other standards as well. So for 9001 for quality, there's a big supplier piece, and some of the other standards as well. It can be quite a big area to manage, because you can have many suppliers offering different things. And especially in small teams where you might not have someone that owns all of those relationships, it might be quite dispersed. It can be quite an easy area to find non-conformities in, because you can always find a supplier that hasn't been reviewed or hasn't been onboarded properly or hasn't been considered. So we talk about this standard evolving, and as it matures, our understanding of what good practice looks like gets better, and the auditors as well, the external auditors, tend to adapt their auditing a bit to the real world. But this is one I think will remain quite a high non-conformity rate suppliers, because it's an important issue and it's a difficult one. In addition, and I think what puts it at the top this time, is there is a new control in the supplier area around cloud use of cloud services. This is a new thing in the standard, which was much needed because cloud computing wasn't really addressed directly before. But obviously these days people use Azure or AWS or Google Cloud to host their networks. And as well as that, there's lots of SaaS services that we use every day. Like, we use ourselves, just Canva for certain things. Google Drive for sharing documents, and Microsoft Office is all cloud-based now, and we use those tools. Adobe Creative Cloud, absolutely. Yeah. So all the big software houses have moved to the cloud. So the new control in that area is talking about that and those relationships with cloud suppliers to make sure that there's a focus on those. Make sure you understand which suppliers you're using, because it's very easy for anyone in the company just to sign up to a service, like Canva, and the people in charge of the ISMS might not even know about it, which is obviously a risky area, because then you might start to put company data into that system without the right controls. So this new control around use of cloud services just makes sure that we know what those services are, that we've evaluated them from a risk perspective. And also the really interesting thing is how you would exit that cloud service. So particularly if you think of companies that have moved their network onto the cloud and using something like Azure, or they've built their own system or their own app on one of those platforms, how easy would it be to move that somewhere else if there was a requirement to? And what we really should be doing with this control is thinking about that before it happens. So having some thought and some planning as to how you might exit the service, when you need to. And that's a new thing and a new perspective. So I think that's why this has come up as number one.
Okay, thank you for that. So now coming into number two, the next one is infrastructure. So can you tell us a bit more about that one, please?
Yeah, of course. Well, infrastructure covers quite a broad range of controls, and this is our categorization because, as I mentioned earlier, the new version of the standard has 4 sections, which is fewer than the old version, which means they're quite broad. So we've had to do some work to categorize them in terms of themes within the controls. But infrastructure is, of course, always a big one because it's something you rely on to do your work. So this is networks, the systems that people need to do their job. And I think the reason it comes up quite high is the severity of those things not working or not being secure. So remember that with information security, we look at confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And all of those 3 things apply to infrastructure of the company. And I think the severity of an impact to that can be quite great. So where there is a problem or a potential weakness, we tend to escalate that as a fairly high issue. In terms of the new standard, there's not particularly any new controls in that area. I guess I would point to things like threat intelligence, which is not so much infrastructure, but it's about protecting the infrastructure. So having an awareness of emerging threats that are out there leans more towards the cybersecurity side of things, which interestingly was an update that they made to the title of this standard. So information security, but it has a kind of a subheading of cybersecurity as well. And I think there's always room for improvement in that area. It's something we tend to look at quite frequently when we go in to do internal audits. So that tends to come up quite often.
Okay, that's really interesting. So going into number 3 now is interested parties.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, the interested parties, funnily enough, because it's a feature of nearly all of the management systems, right? So the management systems are built on Annex SL, or Annex L now it's called, which gave a common structure to how these systems are built. So whether it's an environmental management system or a health and safety management system, or as it is here, an information security management system, the requirement is very similar about identifying who your interested parties are, what their needs and expectations are, and how your management system meets those. So that's, in theory, that should be fairly commonplace and fairly well established, even in the older version of the standard. But I think the reason this comes up here is separate to the transition to the new standard. ISO issued an update, or what they're called a clarification, within that area of interested parties and within the area of context of the organisation.
Mm-hmm.
And what they then required, and we've got a blog on this on our website, so maybe you'll put that into the notes of this session if you can.
Absolutely, yeah.
But they required that everyone would consider whether climate change was a relevant issue to their management system, which sounds like a good idea. But when you're working in a company and you're running their information security management system, you're not necessarily thinking about climate change as a feature of that, because you're thinking about the risks to your information, right? Now, obviously, as ISO consultants, we were aware of this change and this mandate from ISO, because that's our job, right? So we were aware that needed to be done. So when we go in to audit the systems, we look at the context of the organisation, we look at the interested parties aspect, and so with the external auditors as well. So they've had the same note from ISO that now requires this. And I think that's the real reason this has come up here. It's always good to review your interested parties, of course, and make sure that you do that. But generally, they don't tend to change a great deal unless there's been a change in the business. So it is an area that tends to be quite static. So this is one of the areas I think that over time will become less of an issue. We'll slip down the list on our dashboard.
Okay, that's really interesting. It's just something that's currently an issue because of the change in the standard. But as you said, hopefully it should slip down. So our next one, we have physical security.
Yeah, great. Well, physical security was a feature of the old standard as well. There is one new control in that area, which talks about physical security monitoring. So how you monitor the security, and ideally you take an active role in that monitoring, which can be tricky for some companies because if you haven't got anything on site to protect, any real assets, anything of value or anything that's confidential, then of course, when you do your risk assessment, the controls you apply to that premises, there probably isn't too many of them. But of course, anything that you do have, like CCTV cameras or intruder alarms or kind of access control on the doors, is all good stuff to have in place. But this monitoring control is one that you should be aware of as a new item, and trying to find a solution to that is what's needed. I think the other thing to draw attention to here is that many organisations are remote working now, so the reliance on a premises, an office or something is less. Although most people have an address or somewhere that they can hire a meeting room or something to work in. And traditionally, I think there was a common practice of excluding all of the physical controls if you didn't have an office and you didn't manage any of those aspects, because obviously the service provider is managing the building and managing all the security of it, and you don't actually have anything there. But one thing to be aware of is if you read through the controls in the physical security section, some of them may be relevant even if you don't have an office to use it in. So, for example, you could take the view that secure destruction of equipment or reuse of equipment, that's not really anything to do with an office environment. That's something that you might do anyway, because you might have staff that have laptops out there, and then when those laptops die, then they need to be brought in and processed and securely destroyed, and that doesn't have a reliance on an office, so we need to track those things. And likewise, the clear desk and clear screen policy, well, you might not have a desk in an office, but obviously you've got a work environment at home now. So the way you apply it might be different. There's still a relevant control to you. So I guess my advice there is don't exclude the whole section immediately just because you don't have an office. Actually read through what's in there and make a decision, control by control.
That's very interesting. Obviously, as you said, a lot of people are going to remote working or hybrid working, so you can't just, actually read it and make sure that you are adhering to everything. And that's probably one of the reasons it has come up so high. Right. Well, finally, it is policy. Policy is the last one on our list. Can you go into a bit more detail about that, please?
Yeah, of course. So again, policy is quite a broad area, isn't it? So within the standard, there's the policy statement, which is a very simple document and tends to be very similar, whichever organisation puts this system in. which doesn't mean it's any less important. It's still a good kind of figurehead and a good thing to aspire to. And within the new version of the standard, there isn't really any major changes in that part of it. So for those that know the standard, we're talking there about the clause 5.2, which is the policy, information security policy. Our dashboard here is talking about policies more broadly, and there's a section, another control in the standard that covers information security policies. So lots of different things that you might have in the company to control information security. So we talked about clear desk, for example. So you might have a clear desk policy that forms part of that pack of policies. And because that's quite a broad section, because there's lots of different policies you can have, and because policies often contain lots of words, again, it's quite an easy way or an easy place to find non-conformances, because you can read things in the policy that aren't being done in practice, or where something's changed, or a moment ago we spoke about people not having offices anymore, working from home. But you might find that some of their policies still reference the office, or kind of are set up for an office environment rather than a home working one. So I think that's part of the evolution of businesses as a whole and how they've changed. And it is hard to keep on top of those policy documents and make sure they're up to date. And so we'll regularly find those. Of course, when you transition to a new version of the standard, there's lots of changes to the policies you need to do anyway. So there's bound to be problems that come out of that, whether it's inconsistencies or a version control or a document issue there. So I think the advice there is just take some extra time to look at your policies that you've got and your documentation. Make sure it applies still to your current situation. Make sure that those policies are then communicated to the relevant people. So that's not just staff, but that could be suppliers that you use that might need to know certain things. It could be customers that are engaging with your systems, or even, in some cases, if you do have a physical premises, it might be the public or people coming onto site that might need to know certain things about your premises. So just check all that over. So the communication is important. And then set in a review schedule to make sure that you keep on top of them, keep updating them, which is a requirement anyway of the standard. But it is hard to keep on top of, especially if ISO isn't your full-time job. Then it's just another thing to remember, right? And that's, again, we can help at Assent with sort of regular check-ins and things like that.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I think, as you said, policies can be quite daunting, quite overwhelming. There could be quite a lot of them, quite wordy. So as I said, we can come and we can give you that help. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to me about our top 5 non-conformances that we have found with the ISO 27001 2022. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. So thank you so much for listening to today's episode. We hope you have enjoyed it. If you have, please make sure you rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the podcast. As Rob said, we will pop some show notes with some links to find this information that we've been talking about in today's episode. And I'll be back with an episode in a couple of weeks.